I have a piece at National Review, wrote about it yesterday. The headline is "The Conservative Movement is Defending Free Markets from Both Sides." For decades, the Republican coalition sat united atop the so-called three-legged stool of fiscal conservatism, traditional values, and a peace-through-strength foreign policy. All of these priorities helped to combat the spread of communism and to create and maintain prosperity at home. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, some on the right have questioned these orthodoxies as new challenges have arisen, such as the rising cost of living and the breakdown of many communities as the economy evolves. Some degree of discussion and even reprioritization about what the right's agenda should be today is necessary and welcome. But when such thinking fails to heed the lessons of the failure of economic central planning and instead jettisons conservatism's long-standing commitment to free markets and limited government, it should be vigorously challenged. Thankfully, new efforts within the conservative movement are doing precisely that, ensuring that Republicans remain committed to free markets and have the policies to address America's most pressing problems in the 21st century. Now, what I find interesting is the pushback, including some from the Heritage Foundation, over this piece. In fact, like Kevin Roberts, a great guy, the president of the Heritage Foundation, really, really respect him. His chief of staff, though, came after me on Twitter over this, calling me a defender of establishment conservatism. I'm like, seriously, dude, you worked for AFP and now you work on Massachusetts Avenue for the most prestigious establishment think tank on the right, and you're calling me a guy in Macon, Georgia? The establishment? Really? Look in the mirror, dude. And the angst of some, and by the way, I just have to note this. It is all young men who are upset about me defending the free market. Some of them couch it as, well, we need to prioritize families over the free market. I don't disagree. The conservative movement needs a family-friendly policy, but you know what's family-friendly? Letting them deal with the markets and the free market as opposed to having government command and control. Who? By the way, folks, let's do a thought experiment here. Who do you think is going to get a better solution for your family? You navigating an arm's length transaction with someone else, or the government dictating terms for you? Well, who do you think is going to arrive at a better solution for your family? You dealing with it, or the government dealing with it for you? Who do you think is going to arrive at the better solution? The free market has elevated more people out of poverty than government control. What I find, and again, I think it's really notable, it's all young men, similarly situated haircuts. The level of groupthink of these young men, they all have, what do you call it, fades on the side, high. It's a group of young men in Washington, D.C., who have finally decided the old people are out of the way and we're going to rethink things, as opposed to having some humility to understand that maybe those who came before you actually had the right idea. We're going to rethink the free market. No, there's no reason to rethink the free market. We need to get back to the free market. And what I've noticed in the conversations with all these young men who are insistent we need to elevate families instead of conversations about the free market is what they're trying to do is say that they have the ideas to benefit families, many of them childless, I might add, in ways that the free market doesn't. The whole thing about the free market is it allows individuals through arm's length transactions to arrive at the best solution for themselves, because your idea of what's best for you is different from your neighbor's idea of what's best for him, is different from his neighbor's idea of what's best for him, and all of them in arm's length transactions can compromise into solutions. It's also notable many of these young men abhor the idea of compromise. So we want a one-size-fits-all government solution from Washington, D.C. I don't disagree with some of the critiques, and what I find interesting is a lot of them read criticisms into a piece where I would actually find large agreement with, including the fact that I don't think the government needs to be funding the education apparatus. In fact, I've been saying for weeks now, instead of cutting off aid to Ukraine, we should be cutting off aid to college campuses. But there's something else that's come up in the criticisms too that I find really, really, really notable. And it's that a lot of these young guys, and again, it's really important to note, it is mostly young men. what I find really notable is that they've confused party and ideology. So many of the criticisms are, well, conservatism didn't give us this, or conservatism gave us that. And it's like, no, George Bush did that. Some of these young men, and again, young men who weren't around when I was around, when George Bush became president, will forget Fred Barnes authoring a piece. He used to be at the Weekly Standard. Fred Barnes authored a piece in the Weekly Standard defending the Bush administration as big government conservatism. And I, a young man then in my early 30s, wrote a piece calling BS on Fred Barnes, saying, then as I say now, notice my consistency over the years, there's no such thing as big government conservatism. Conservatism is premised on limited government because as you limit government, you expand freedom and opportunity for others through the free market to negotiate for themselves their freedoms and liberties. You can't have a big government conservative because as government rises, freedom reduces. But that was the spin of the time. I am the guy who did the interview with Rush Limbaugh in 2005 after Bush's reelection, where Rush Limbaugh said George W. Bush was a very nice man and a very good president, but he was not a conservative. And it made headlines at the time. I was the guy who did the interview, and Rush was then right. Absolutely. George W. Bush wasn't a conservative. He was a Republican. And what I'm finding is, this goes back to a point I've made years ago, Bill Clinton was the worst thing to happen to the conservative movement. What do I mean by that? Bill Clinton destroyed the Democratic Party in the 1990s. So many Democrats in the South and Midwest became Republicans because they abhorred being in a party with a man of that lack of self-control and bad character. They became Republicans. And suddenly the conservative movement, which used to work across the aisle in Washington and build coalitions between Republicans and Democrats, they never had to reach out across the aisle. They could spend all of their time in the Republican Party and forming ideas within the Republican Party, and they lost the skill set to persuade. That's why you see so many of these young men in Washington and the conservative movement just yelling online now. Conservatives, by losing the need to reach out across the aisle, became consumed with the Republican Party, and the Republican Party and the conservative movement began to look as one. And a lot of the criticisms of this piece I wrote are from people who believe that the party and the ideas are the same thing, and they're not. In fact, one of the things I see, and it's a danger side, I think, from Heritage and other groups out there in Washington right now, is so aligning themselves with one political party and one man in particular, Donald Trump, who, by the way, is not an ideologue at all. He's in it for himself, and maybe you can control him and give him ideas, but you're wrapping your ideas around one man or one party. You're identifying them so much, and so the ideas rise and fall with the party. So, for example, the number of people, I saw some dude, I forget, he called himself like in the Austrian economic school or something, clearly a weirdo. He said that conservatism has given us transgenderism. No, definitely not. It's not conservative in any way, shape, and form, and no one in the conservative movement advocates for it. Then he says conservatism has given us $35 trillion in national debt. No, Republicans and Democrats did that. Had they followed conservative ideals, they would have never done it. And in fact, when they did listen to conservatives in 2013, we got sequestration, which was the first real-world cut in government, not just future growth of government, that we've seen since the balanced budget days of the late 90s. Also, something authored by conservatives and sold to the Republican Party. Conservatives aren't flawless people, but one of the geniuses of conservatism is we recognize men are inherently bad. We have an accurate view of humanity. That's why the free market is better than government control and industrial policy set by Washington, D.C. What's so crazy to me right now is a lot of the young men in Washington who are upset about this piece. If you follow their social media history, they have massive tirades against the elite in Washington, D.C. And yet somehow they think their elite positions are going to be better than the elite positions of the left. That somehow their experts are better than the left's experts, as opposed to let's just let the free market decide. I agree with the criticisms that we need to elevate family in terms of conservative policy. I don't disagree, and neither does my piece. But for those who say that we need to forget about the free market, stop defending the free market for the sake of defending the free market, I'm not defending the free market for the sake of defending the free market. I'm defending the free market because history has shown arm's length transactions in a free marketplace are the best way for families to decide for themselves what's best for them instead of a government elite. I find it richly ironic that the people at Heritage and elsewhere who have an issue with this piece are calling me a member of the conservative establishment. They're at the Heritage Foundation, for God's sakes. People want to abandon long-held conservative ideas. That's fine with me. Just stop calling yourself conservative. You're a progressive on the right. You're a populist on the right. Conservative principles, every time they're tried in this country, have worked successfully to rein in government. And by the way, if you actually get Congress to embrace these ideas again and start cutting and gutting government, it becomes hard for the left to get those powers back because Congress has acted. So maybe instead of belly aching about me defending the free market when it's really noticeable that you all ignored every other issue, maybe stop trying to align yourself with a political movement and get back to selling ideas that work. As much as I have been accused in the last 24 hours of worshiping at the altar of the idol of the free market, a lot of these guys are idol worshipers themselves, and they don't want to admit it. And they're idol worshiping power for the sake of power, not ideas for the sake of ideas. And I beg to differ with them on power for the sake of power, because if you can get power, you can lose power. But if you hold on to an idea that's tried and true and works, you don't ever have to give that up.